Someone once walked into a capital city wearing the wrong uniform, said, "I am the ruler now," and people listened. Not because he was royal, but because nobody dared to question him. This video is about 44 real impostors who almost stole thrones, empires, and nations simply by acting like they belonged there. 1. You cannot talk about audacious impostors without mentioning the only man to ever conquer America without firing a shot, Joshua Norton. In 1859, this broke businessman in San Francisco didn't try to steal a throne, he just invented one. He walked into a newspaper office and paid to publish a decree declaring himself Norton Ye, Emperor of the United States. By all logic, he should have been sent to an asylum. Instead, the people of San Francisco just said, "Sure, why not?" Police officers saluted him in the street, restaurants gave him free meals, and theaters reserved the best seats for him. He even issued his own currency, which local shops actually accepted. He once fired the entire US Congress for being useless. And while Congress ignored him, most Americans agreed it was a solid move. He ruled for 21 years solely on the power of good vibes and a fancy hat. 2. The captain of Kopenick is the ultimate proof that Germans really love uniforms. In 1906, an ex-convict and shoemaker named Wilhelm Voigt bought a used captain's uniform at a thrift shop. He put it on, walked onto the street, and saw a group of soldiers. He barked an order at them, and because he was wearing a shiny coat, they immediately obeyed. He marched them to the town hall of Kopenick, arrested the mayor, and confiscated the city treasury, claiming it was an imperial order. Nobody asked for ID. Nobody called the palace. They just saw the epaulets and handed over the cash. He then told them to stay put and took a train home to have a beer. He became a folk hero because he proved that you don't need royal blood to rule a city. You just need a nice hat and a loud voice. 3. In 1817, the British upper class was humiliated by a cobbler's daughter named Mary Baker. She was found wandering a village wearing a turban and speaking absolute gibberish. Instead of checking her pockets for ID, the locals decided she was Princess Caribou from the island of Javasu. Note that Javasu does not exist. She made it up. She climbed trees, swam naked in the lake, and prayed to a pot. And the wealthy elites just nodded and said, "Ah, yes, royal culture." They fed her exotic foods and wrote down her language, which was just random noises she was inventing on the spot. The scam only crashed when a local woman recognized her and said, "That is not a princess. That is Mary from Devonshire, who fixes shoes," ending the weirdest summer in British history. 4. In 1436, France experienced the greatest case of mass gaslighting in human history, involving none other than Joan of Arc. Everyone knew Joan had been burned at the stake 5 years earlier. Thousands of people literally watched it happen. But then a woman named Claude d'Armoise marched into town wearing armor and said, "Hey guys, I am back. The fire didn't work." Any rational person would call the asylum, but instead, Joan's own 2 brothers looked at this stranger and said, "Yep, that is definitely our sister." They traveled around France accepting gifts, free dinners, and endless wine from towns eager to celebrate the zombie heroine. The scam only fell apart when she met the king, who asked her to reveal a secret sign Joan had told him years ago. Claude, realizing she couldn't read minds, confessed she was just a random mother of 2 who wanted a vacation from her kids. 5. In 1487, the entire English government was nearly toppled by a 10-year-old kid named Lambert Simnel, who clearly had no idea what was happening. A random priest grabbed this confused boy, put him in some nice clothes, and convinced thousands of grown adults that this child was the Earl of Warwick. It did not matter that the real Earl was literally waving at people from a castle window in London at that exact moment. The rebels ignored facts and crowned the kid in Dublin using a golden hoop they stole from a church statue because they forgot to bring a real crown. When the king finally caught them, he realized the kid was just a pawn. So instead of a dungeon, he sent the king to the royal kitchen to peel potatoes and turn meat spits, which honestly is a pretty solid career change for a 10-year-old imposter. 6. Gregor MacGregor was a Scottish soldier who realized that stealing a throne was risky. so he invented a country instead. In 1820, he announced he was the cacique of a nation called Poye in Central America. He promised gold, opera houses, and fertile land. Investors poured in money, settlers sold everything, and ships sailed out. When they arrived, there was no country, just swamp, disease, and confusion. MacGregor was already living comfortably in Europe, proving that in the right century, a confident brochure could outrun reality. 7. The false Dmitri. I pulled off the greatest con in Russian history mostly because nobody checked his table manners. This runaway monk claimed to be the long-lost son of the Tsar and somehow marched right into Moscow to take the throne in 1605. The people were so desperate for a new leader they just ignored that he looked nothing like royalty and acted totally different. But his approval ratings tanked because of one tiny hilarious detail. He ate with a fork. Russians at the time used spoons and hands. So when they saw Dmitri using a metal-pronged tool for his dinner, they decided he must be evil. He literally lost an entire empire because he refused to eat his roast beef with his bare hands like a regular person. 8. Gabriel de Espinosa proves that you should never let your dreams be dreams, even if you are just a pastry chef who wants to run Portugal. In the late 16th century, this guy looked in the mirror and decided he was actually King Sebastian, who had vanished 20 years earlier. He did not have an army or a plan, but he had confidence. He walked around Spain acting mysterious and somehow convinced a very wealthy nun to give him all her jewelry to fund his fake royal lifestyle. He was living the high life, eating great food and bossing people around, solely because he looked vaguely like a guy on a coin. The authorities eventually caught on, mostly because kings usually do not smell like flour and yeast, ending the shortest and tastiest reign in history. 9. Ancient Persia hosted the most stressful game of dress-up ever when a wizard named Gaumata stole the throne while missing a very key body part. He looked exactly like the king's brother, so while the real king was away, Gaumata just sat on the throne and hoped for the best. He stayed inside the palace and refused to see anyone, which should have been a red flag. The problem was that he had no ears because they had been sliced off years prior for bad behavior. The gig was up when one of the royal wives crept in while he was napping and felt the side of his head. She realized there was nothing there but smooth skin, and the whole empire realized they had been bowing down to an earless magician who was just really good at wearing hats. 10. Perkin Warbeck was the ultimate medieval freeloader who turned identity theft into a full-time job. In the 1490s, this boatman's son claimed to be the Duke of York and managed to crash on the couches of European royalty for 6 whole years. The King of France and the Emperor gave him money, clothes, and armies just to annoy England. The funny part is that Perkin was a terrible soldier. He invaded England 3 times, and every single time a battle started, he panicked and ran away before the fighting even got real. He was essentially a professional actor who forgot his lines the moment the audience showed up. King Henry VII found him so pathetic that he initially just kept him around court to show everyone what a bad liar looked like. 11. Lord Gordon Gordon was the mysterious British aristocrat who nearly caused a war between the United States and Canada in the 1870s, despite not actually being a lord, a Gordon, or even rich. He showed up in Minnesota claiming to be a Scottish earl, looking to invest millions. The richest men in America, including the legendary Jay Gould, were so desperate to be friends with royalty that they threw money at him. Gould gave him a fortune in stocks just to impress him. When the check bounced and they realized he was just a con artist, Gordon fled to Canada. The Americans were so mad they actually sent a militia to kidnap him, creating a massive international incident. It is hilarious that Wall Street tycoons, the sharks of capitalism, were outsmarted by a guy whose entire strategy was wearing a monocle and speaking with a fancy accent. 12. If you thought the first false Dmitri in Russia was ridiculous, wait until you meet false Dmitri II, who appeared just a year later. This man was likely the son of a priest or a converted Jewish teacher. And the funniest part is that he looked absolutely nothing like the previous impostor or the real prince. Yet, the widow of the first false Dmitri Marina Mniszek, was so desperate to stay in power that she publicly embraced this stranger and claimed he was her miraculously saved husband. It was the most awkward family reunion in history because everyone knew they were lying, but they needed a figurehead to fight the Tsar. This rebel of Tushino actually set up a parallel government just a few miles from Moscow, complete with his own court and boyars who played along with the charade. 13. In 1767, a mysterious healer named Stefan Mali wandered into Montenegro and accidentally became its ruler. He never claimed to be the Russian Tsar Peter III, but when locals whispered it, he didn't correct them. The rumor solved a problem. Having a powerful patron sounded better than chaos. Even when Catherine the Great sent a general to expose him, the situation was quietly ignored. For 6 years, this man ruled not because the story was convincing, but because everyone preferred it to the alternatives. 14. The Roman Empire had a major headache with a slave named Clemens, who decided to identity theft the Emperor Tiberius's grandson. Clemens was actually on his way to save the real grandson, Postumus Agrippa, from exile, but he arrived too late and found him dead. Instead of going home, Clemens stole the prince's ashes and realized he looked enough like the dead man to fool people. He grew a beard, started whispering in dark corners of Italian towns, and gathered a massive following of people who hated Tiberius. By the time he marched toward Rome, he had thousands of supporters and even senators funding his cause. The emperor was terrified to arrest him publicly because the mob loved this fake prince so much. When they finally caught him and asked how he became Agrippa, Clemens gave the sassiest answer in Roman history, telling the emperor that he became Agrippa the same way Tiberius became emperor. 15. Everyone in Rome knew that Emperor Nero loved singing and playing the lyre more than actually ruling, which makes the story of the false Nero hilarious. A few years after Nero died, a man named Terentius Maximus appeared in the East. He looked like Nero. He had the same hairstyle, and most importantly, he could play the lyre really well. That was apparently all the proof anyone needed. He gained a huge following in Greece and then moved to Parthia, Rome's greatest enemy. The Parthian king held a grudge against Rome, so he welcomed this musical impostor with open arms, treating him like the true emperor just to annoy the Romans. It almost sparked a massive international war, all because a guy who could strum a few tunes decided to impersonate one of the most infamous rulers in history. 16. Yemelyan Pugachev was a dissatisfied Cossack who decided to lead a peasant revolt in Russia by claiming to be Peter III, the husband of Catherine the Great. The fact that Peter III had died years earlier, and that Pugachev was visibly a rough Cossack who did not speak a word of French or German, did not stop him. When people asked for proof of his royal identity, he did not show them documents or jewels. Instead, he dramatically ripped open his shirt and showed them royal marks on his chest, which were actually just scars from a skin disease called scrofula. The peasants, who had no idea what a czar was supposed to look like, decided that these random boils were definitely signs of divinity. He managed to gather a massive army and capture several fortresses, creating a bizarre alternative kingdom where illiterate peasants were given titles like Count and General just for joining his fan club. 17. In the year 1300, a woman arrived in Norway claiming to be Queen Margaret, the Maid of Norway, who was the rightful heir to the Scottish throne. There was just one massive, glaring problem with her story that everyone politely ignored at first. The real Margaret had died as a 7-year-old girl about 10 years earlier. This impostor was a woman in her 40s with gray hair and a husband. She basically looked at a portrait of a child and said, "Yeah, puberty hit me really hard, guys." The locals were so confused, or perhaps just bored, that they actually let her play queen for a while. She rode around town and let people kiss her hand until the authorities finally pointed out that she was literally old enough to be the dead princess's grandmother. It turns out she was just a random German woman who thought being a queen looked like a fun retirement plan. 18. Ancient Rome had its own version of a soap opera when a man showed up claiming to be Alexander, the son of King Herod of Judea. The real Alexander had been executed by his own father years ago. But this new guy looked kind of like him, which was good enough for the crowd. He traveled all the way to Rome with a posse of believers who showered him with cash, treating him like a rock star. He even got a meeting with Emperor Augustus. But Augustus was a smart guy. He asked to shake the prince's hand and immediately knew it was a fake. Why? Because the impostor had rough, calloused hands from working a manual job his whole life, while a real prince would have hands as soft as a baby's bottom because they never lifted anything heavier than a grape. The guy's entire royal campaign was ruined because he forgot to moisturize. 19. In the 13th century, the people of Flanders were grieving their lost count, Baldwin IX, who had vanished during the Crusades while also being the Emperor of Constantinople. 20 years later, a hermit walked out of the forest wearing ragged clothes and a long beard, and the locals decided, yep, that is definitely our emperor. This guy was clearly just a random hermit who enjoyed living in the woods, but the townspeople dragged him to the city and started throwing parades. The funniest part is that the hermit barely spoke and seemed confused by everything, which people interpreted as royal mystery, instead of, I have no idea what is going on. He eventually met the King of France, who asked him basic questions like, hey, remember when we got married? And the hermit could not answer a single thing, proving that maybe picking a random guy from the bushes is not the best way to choose a government leader. 20. Giannino di Guccio was a wealthy merchant in Siena, living a perfectly fine life, until someone told him he was secretly King John I of France. Instead of laughing, he believed it completely. He sold his business, hired mercenaries, and spent years demanding a crown that had never been his. European courts treated him like entertainment, not royalty. He ended up broke and imprisoned, all because medieval Europe had the world's first scam email. You are a prince. Please respond urgently. 21. After the death of King Olaf of Denmark and Norway in 1387, a guy in Prussia decided it was his time to shine. He claimed to be the dead King Olaf, saying he had not actually died but had escaped and been hiding for 15 years. The Queen Mother, Margaret I, was understandably skeptical since she had literally buried her son herself. She invited the impostor for a chat, and the moment he walked in, the game was over. Not only did he not speak a word of Danish, which is a pretty big requirement for being the King of Denmark, but he also admitted he was just a sick man from Bohemia. He tried to claim that his nurses had told him he was a king while he was delirious with a fever. It was the "I was hallucinating" defense. The queen was not amused by this waste of time and sent him to be burned, proving that if you are going to impersonate a king, you should at least learn the language on the flight over. 22. Sarah Wilson proves that you can conquer America with nothing but a stolen dress and an attitude. In 1771, she was a maid for Queen Charlotte of England until she was caught stealing royal jewelry and shipped off to the colonies as a convict. Instead of working on a farm, she escaped, put on the stolen fancy clothes, and introduced herself as Princess Susanna, the Queen's sister. She claimed she had been exiled for a scandalous romance. The colonists in Virginia and the Carolinas were so starstruck by royalty that they threw banquets in her honor and let her sleep in their best beds. She traveled the South accepting free money and adoration, living better than the actual governor, simply because nobody in America knew what the real Queen's sister looked like. 23. The mystery of the lost Dauphin of France spawned hundreds of frauds, but Karl Wilhelm Naundorf was the undisputed champion of delusion. He claimed to be Louis XVII, the son of Marie Antoinette, who had escaped prison. There were just a few tiny hilarious holes in his story. First, he was a German clockmaker who barely spoke French, and when he did, he sounded like a tourist asking for the bathroom. Second, he was rude, messy, and had zero royal charisma. Despite this, he moved to Paris and sued the actual royal family for his rightful inheritance. He was so aggressively confident that even after he died, his tombstone was carved with Louis XVII, King of France. He literally trolled the French monarchy from beyond the grave, proving that if you lie loudly enough in a German accent, people will eventually just give up and believe you. 24. Mary Bainton was the teenage queen of the fake ID scam in Tudor England. In 1533, this random girl wandered into a village and noticed people staring at her fancy clothes. Instead of admitting she stole them, she whispered that she was Princess Mary, the daughter of King Henry VIII. The locals instantly panicked and started treating her like a VIP to avoid getting beheaded. Mary realized she had struck gold. She went on a nationwide party tour, demanding free banquets and money from terrified nobles who didn't want to offend the king's daughter. She wasn't trying to raise an army or steal the throne. She just wanted to crash parties and eat expensive swan meat on someone else's dime. When she was finally caught, the court realized she was just a bored teenager and let her go, probably because they were impressed by her audacity. 25. Sultan Yahya claimed to be the son of an Ottoman sultan and spent 40 years touring Europe asking for armies. His pitch never changed. Help me take Istanbul and I'll convert to Christianity. Nobody checked the math. Nobody got an army. Yahya collected pensions, free housing, and endless meals while promising a crusade that never came. He never fought a battle, never ruled anything, and still lived like royalty. At this point, the throne was basically an Airbnb. 26. The award for the laziest impostor of all time goes to a man in 12th century Byzantium who tried to be Emperor Alexios II. The real Alexios had been strangled and dumped into the ocean, which is usually a career-ending injury. But this impostor, a peasant from a totally different region, decided to give it a shot. He didn't look like the emperor. He didn't sound like the emperor. He didn't even have a plan. He just walked into a city and said, "I am him." When people asked why he looked so different, he said his appearance had changed because he had suffered so much. It was the "I look bad because I'm tired" excuse. Amazingly, people bought it because they hated the current guy in charge. He gathered a mob and started a riot, proving that you don't need a good disguise if the public is angry enough to follow a random guy with a confident limp. 27. In 1860, a French lawyer named Aurélie Antoine decided that his office job was boring and that being a king sounded way more fun. He packed his bags, traveled to South America, walked into the Mapuche territory in Chile, and simply declared himself the king of Araucania and Patagonia. He wrote a fancy constitution, designed a flag, and even minted coins for a country that existed entirely in his imagination. The local tribes were actually fine with it because they thought he was hilarious, but the Chilean government was not amused. They arrested him and put him on trial for treason. The judge looked at this lawyer wearing a homemade crown and ruled that he was not a criminal, but just a lunatic, and shipped him back to France. Amazingly, he tried to return 3 more times to reclaim his imaginary throne, proving that delusion is the strongest fuel in the world. 28. Imagine washing dirty togas for a living and then deciding you are the heir to an empire. That was the life of Andriscus in 149 BC. He was a lowly laundry worker, a fuller, who suddenly started telling people he was Philip, the son of the king of Macedonia. He had no money, no army, and smelled like cleaning fluid, but he had confidence. He traveled to Thrace and somehow convinced a barbarian chief to lend him an army. Against all odds, the laundry guy actually invaded Macedonia, defeated a Roman legion, and ruled for a year. He even wore the royal purple cloak and minted coins with his face on them. The Roman Empire, the greatest power on earth, had to send a massive military force just to remind him that he was actually just really good at getting stains out of fabric, not running a kingdom. 29. In the 11th century, the Byzantine Empire was nearly destroyed by a man known as pseudo-Dionysius, which sounds like a bad knockoff brand. He claimed to be Leo Diogenes, the son of the emperor who had died in battle years earlier. This impostor managed to convince the terrifying Cuman tribes that he was the rightful heir, mostly because the Cumans just wanted an excuse to loot things. They gave him a massive army to invade the Balkans, and the current emperor, Alexios I, was sweating bullets because this fake prince was actually winning battles. The scam ended during a peace banquet when the emperor's men invited the impostor for a drink and promptly arrested him the moment his bodyguards looked away. The Cuman army looked around, realized their ticket to riches was in jail, and just went home, leaving the impostor to explain why he wasn't royal. 30. London, In the 1820s saw the rise of Princess Olive of Cumberland, a woman who treated the British royal family like a customer service department she wanted to speak to the manager of. Olive Wilmot was a painter who suddenly produced papers claiming she was the secret legitimate daughter of the Duke of Cumberland. She didn't just want a fancy title. She demanded millions of pounds in back pay. She rode around London in a carriage painted with the royal crest and wrote angry letters to the king, calling him her cousin. The best part is that her documents were obvious forgeries. Some were signed King George, but written on paper that was manufactured years after the king had died. She ended up in debtor's prison, still shouting that she was a princess, maintaining a level of confidence that is honestly inspiring. 31. In 16th century Spain, a man appeared claiming to be Don Carlos, the son of King Philip II. The real prince had been deformed, unstable, and very dead. This impostor was healthy and confident. When questioned, he claimed God had healed him in secret. The story made no sense, but it didn't need to. The region hated taxes and authority, and belief became a form of protest. Facts mattered less than momentum. 32. Thomas the Slav proved that in the 9th century, you could get surprisingly far just by being the only guy in the room with confidence. He was a runaway slave who decided that manual labor was for chumps, so he claimed to be the Emperor Constantine VI. The real Constantine had been blinded by his own mother years earlier, but Thomas just told everyone, "I got better, it's a miracle." He managed to convince the entire naval fleet and the provinces of Asia Minor that he was the true ruler. He didn't just have a few followers, he besieged Constantinople for a full year. The actual emperor had to call in favors from the Bulgarians just to defeat this random slave who nearly stole the Byzantine Empire, essentially because he put on a fancy hat and refused to blink. 33. The Tichborne claimant is the heavyweight champion of fake it till you make it. A skinny, French-speaking aristocrat named Roger vanished at sea. Decades later, a butcher from Australia named Arthur Orton showed up claiming to be him. There were just two tiny problems. Arthur weighed nearly 300 pounds and spoke with a thick Cockney accent. He didn't know a word of French and couldn't remember anything about Roger's life. But Roger's mother was so desperate, she just ignored reality. She looked at this giant, uneducated butcher and said, "Yep, that is my skinny French son." The court case became a national obsession, with people arguing for years whether a man could accidentally gain 200 pounds and forget his own native language just by sitting in the sun too long. 34. Mary Carleton was the original Tinder swindler of the 1660s. She arrived in London covered in fake jewels, crying that she was a German princess named Maria von Wollway who was fleeing a bad marriage. A lawyer named John Carleton saw dollar signs and proposed to her, thinking he was marrying into royalty. Mary accepted, thinking she was marrying a rich lawyer. The morning after the wedding was incredibly awkward when they both realized they had scammed each other. He was broke, and she was actually a thief from Canterbury. She became an instant celebrity, starring in plays about her own life and writing books about how great she was at lying. She proved that if you're going to be a fraud, you might as well be famous for it. 35. In 1920s Germany, a homeless waiter named Harry de Melle accidentally discovered the easiest hack in history. He realized that if he shaved his head and acted incredibly arrogant to service staff, everyone assumed he was Prince Wilhelm of Prussia. He didn't even have to say, "I am the prince." He just walked into luxury hotels, looked at the floor with disgust, and sighed. The managers, terrified of offending the Kaiser's grandson, gave him the presidential suites, free champagne, and 5-course meals. He traveled across the country living like a rock star without spending a single penny, fueled entirely by the German public's obsession with bowing down to anyone who looked slightly snooty. He was only caught because he eventually got bored of the high life and tried to join the French Foreign Legion. 36. In early 18th century London, George Psalmanazar convinced scholars he was from Formosa, modern Taiwan. He was a blonde European who explained this by saying Formosan nobles lived underground. He invented a language, fake customs, and wrote a best-selling book. Oxford professors believed him. He even taught classes. Years later, he admitted everything. The lie collapsed quietly, leaving one uncomfortable lesson behind. Expertise sounds convincing when nobody wants to look ignorant. 37. The most iconic impostor of the 20th century was, undoubtedly, Anna Anderson, who spent her life convincing the world she was Grand Duchess Anastasia of Russia. After being pulled from a canal in Berlin in 1920, she refused to speak. But rumors swirled that she was the Tsar's daughter who had escaped execution. There was just one massive red flag. She didn't speak a word of Russian, not one. She claimed she was too traumatized to speak her native tongue, which is a convenient excuse. Despite this, she knew intimate details of court life, which split the remaining Romanov family in half. Some cousins believed her. Others called her a fraud. It took until years after her death for DNA tests to prove she was actually Franziska Szankowska, a Polish factory worker, proving that if you act mysterious enough, people will ignore the fact that you can't speak your own language. 38. Germany in the late 13th century saw the rise of Tile Kolop, a wood-turner who decided to impersonate Emperor Frederick II. This was a particularly bold choice considering Frederick had been dead for 35 years, and everyone knew it. Tile showed up in the city of Cologne, claiming that he hadn't died, but had been hiding in the Holy Land, waiting for the right moment to return. Despite the fact that he looked nothing like the emperor and was clearly just a random guy with a stick, the locals hated the current nobility so much they decided to roll with it. He set up a royal court, issued official documents with a fake seal, and held lavish feasts. The neighboring princes were baffled by this zombie emperor act until they finally marched in and ruined the party, ending the career of the world's most optimistic woodworker. 39. The obsession with the missing King Sebastian of Portugal produced many impostors, but the King of Penamacor was definitely the funniest. His real name was Mateus Alvarez, and he was basically a hermit who lived in a cave. He didn't even publicly claim to be the king at first. He just acted weird and mysterious until the local villagers started rumors for him. Once the rumors started, he bought some nice clothes, gathered a band of followers, and set up a royal court inside his cave. He began knighting local farmers and promising them high-ranking government jobs once he retook Lisbon. The sheer ridiculousness of a cave-dwelling king handing out titles to peasants makes this one of the greatest low-budget rebellions in history. He was eventually caught, but you have to respect the hustle of running a kingdom from a hole in the ground. 40. The obsession with the missing French Dauphin reached peak absurdity in the forests of Wisconsin in the mid-19th century. Eleazar Williams was a Native American missionary who spent his life preaching the gospel until one day he allegedly hit his head, or just got bored, and decided he was actually Louis XVII, the King of France. Never mind that he had dark skin, no French accent, and looked nothing like a Bourbon. He claimed his memory had suddenly returned after years of amnesia. The craziest part is that people believed him. European aristocrats actually traveled to his log cabin in Wisconsin to bow to him. He was offered luxury trips to France, but he turned them down, saying he preferred the quiet life, which is a convenient way of saying, if I go to Paris, they will realize I am just a guy from Green Bay. 41. Helga de la Brache. In late 19th century Sweden pulled off a scam that was basically a soap opera script come to life. She showed up claiming to be the secret, illegitimate daughter of the exiled King Gustav IV Adolf. She had no birth certificate, but she had a fantastic story about secret marriages, convents, and political cover-ups. She cried on cue, fainted dramatically, and managed to charm the socks off the sitting parliament. They were so moved by her tragic and completely fictional life story that they voted to give her a generous royal pension paid by the taxpayers. She lived in luxury for years on the government's dime, until a newspaper reporter finally did a basic background check and found out she was just a maid from Stockholm who had watched too many plays. 42. David Rubeni was a man who proved that if you ride a white horse and look mysterious, you can get away with anything. In 1524, he arrived in Venice claiming to be the brother of a king from a lost Jewish kingdom in Arabia. He wasn't begging for money, he was offering an alliance. he demanded cannons and ships to fight the Ottoman Empire. His confidence was so overwhelming that the Pope himself gave him an audience and letters of recommendation. The King of Portugal was so impressed that he promised Rubeni a fleet of ships. For years, this random adventurer was treated like a head of state by the most powerful men in Europe, all because he promised them an army that existed entirely in his imagination. The scam only fell apart when he tried his luck with the Holy Roman Emperor, who was less impressed by the white horse and threw him in chains. 43. Lola Montez was the 19th century equivalent of an Instagram influencer who filters her photos so much she becomes a different ethnicity. Born Eliza Gilbert in Ireland, she decided that being Irish was boring, so she reinvented herself as a spicy Spanish flamenco dancer. She couldn't actually dance, her flamenco was mostly just hopping around, but King Ludwig I of Bavaria didn't care. He was so obsessed with this fake Spanish beauty that he made her a countess and essentially let her run the government. She was dictating policy and firing professors she didn't like, all while smoking cigars and carrying a whip. The people of Bavaria were so offended that an Irish fraud was ruining their country that they started a literal revolution. The king had to abdicate and Lola had to flee, proving that bad dancing can actually topple a monarchy. 44. In 1812, while Napoleon was freezing in Russia, a general named Claude-François de Mallet decided to steal the French Empire using nothing but a fake letter and a lot of confidence. Mallet escaped from a mental institution, put on a fancy uniform, and walked up to a barracks in Paris. He told the soldiers, "Bad news, guys, Napoleon is dead. I am the boss now." And because he spoke with authority, everyone just believed him. He managed to replace the government, release prisoners, and even arrest the chief of police, who went quietly because he didn't want to argue with a general. Mallet controlled Paris for a few hours until one skeptical officer finally asked to see his papers. When the scam was revealed, the entire government was embarrassed that they had been overthrown by one mental patient with a good poker face. After all these stories, one thing should be obvious. Most of these scams didn't survive because they were clever. They survived because people played along. So here's the real challenge. Which ruler in history do you secretly think might have been an impostor too, and why have we never seriously questioned them? Say it in the comments. If this made you uncomfortable, like and subscribe. That's exactly the point.